Hi, I'm Carolyn Kolb with Wind Dancer Garden in Salem, Oregon. I thought it'd be interesting if we talked about the 10 most asked questions that I get because it gives you insight into and maybe answer some of your questions about ornamental grasses. So the number one question that I get about ornamental grasses is, do they die down in the winter? And the wonderful answer to that is no, they don't die down. They really keep their structure all winter long. And that's especially true of the warm season grasses like the miscanthus and the pennisetum. You'll find that when you are ready to cut them down in the spring, that the inflorescence or the blooms are still absolutely gorgeous in March, and it's kind of sad to cut them down. But it's important to do that, and I'll talk about that later. But just know that the structure all winter long of ornamental grasses really keeps the winter garden interesting, and it provides a lot of movement and cover for the birds as well. Okay, the second most asked question is, do I cut these grasses off? And the basic answer to that question is if it's deciduous in the winter, if it turns tan in the winter, you'll want to cut them off. And you'll cut them off when you first see that little green growth, that little sprout in the spring, and it varies depending on what the temperature is. When you see that first growth, that means that you will cut them off 2 to 3 inches above the ground. That allows the sun to penetrate down to the roots, warm them up, and whoosh, up they come again. So when do you cut them off? I just answered that question. That's another question I get very frequently, and that is when you see the first green growth coming up in the spring. Now, I didn't cover the evergreen grasses. If it's evergreen, if it stays blue or brown or green all winter long, then that's an evergreen grass, and they will resent being cut off in the springtime. So what you do is you just ponytail them up and you just cut off the top third, or however much is damaged from the winter. Usually just a couple of inches will do it. And then just fluff them out with your fingers a little bit, and the dead leaves will come out when you rake them a little bit. Okay, another really important question is how far apart do I plant the grasses? And there's a rule of thumb that says if they're 6 feet tall, you plant them 3 feet apart if you want them to be a nice hedge or a drift. But if you want to see each plant individually, then you'll want to plant them 6 feet apart if they're 6 feet tall. It also depends on how wide the grass gets. Some of them will get very wide as they are tall, and some of them are very tall and narrow. So it really depends on the look you want. You know, do you want a screen where everything will grow together, then you'll plant them a little bit closer together. Or if you want just an individual specimen plant, then you'll want to have more room around it. Also, people will say, well, now, what is full sun? Because I've got part sun and part shade. Well, if you have a warm season grass that really loves the sun, you'll need 6 full hours of sun a day. That can be morning sun or afternoon sun, but full sun is at least 6 hours. Now, some variegated grasses will do well with a little bit more shade. If it's variegated, they will take more shade than if they're solid green. Fertilization. You don't really need to fertilize grasses once they're established, but I recommend that when you plant them, that you put a couple of tablespoons of a timed-release fertilizer in the hole, and you water it really well that first year. That will get the roots to grow deep and make it more drought tolerant in the following years. But if you put too much nitrogen on grasses in the summertime, they tend to grow too fast and they'll be a little bit more floppy. And that's another question I get is, I have a grass that just tends to flop, and what do I do about that? Well, there's a couple of things you can do. First of all, some varieties flop more than others, so you could change the variety if you don't like that floppiness. But another thing to do that I think is a really good idea, especially with something like a miscanthus, is if it tends to flop over when it gets its seed heads on it. If you just take some loppers and lop it off about a third, about the 1st of July actually, then it will grow thicker and fuller, maybe not quite as tall, but it will not flop, and that's a really good, easy thing to do. Invasive plants. I think it's really important not to plant plants that are invasive in your particular area. So here in the Pacific Northwest, things are not nearly as invasive as they might be in, say, Florida or California. But I really recommend that you don't plant invasive plants, and I don't carry invasive plants. Some of my plants will tend to run by underground rhizomes, for instance the Carex ice dance. But you know, you want to place those in a spot where you want that to happen. In other words, you want bank stabilization, or you want a ground cover that's weed free. Then that's the perfect place to use that. If you want something to stay in a clump, then you'd need to buy, you know, the Carex Gold Band, which is a clumper, and it doesn't send out rhizomes. Grasses like black mondo grass actually have underground rhizomes as well, but they're very, very slow to propagate and to run. So just know in your particular area what is invasive and what isn't. Also, reseeding. There are a few grasses that will reseed, maybe more so in other areas than our climate. We have, you know, rather short growing season, so we tend to not have reseeding problems that you might in other parts of the country. But I will tell you if that a particular plant tends to reseed, and then you can decide whether or not that will work in the area that you want it. For instance, Mexican feathergrass tends to reseed not heavily, and they're very little tiny plants, so they're easy to pull up. But what I find is that people that plant Mexican feathergrass love it so much that if it comes up in another place, they really don't care, especially if it's planted in a meadow type situation or in an area where it won't take over for some other things. But Mexican feathergrass and a few other grasses tend to not look so great after about the third year. So if you let the babies grow, then you can take out the mother plant and you have brand new fresh baby plants. Dividing grasses. Usually divide grasses in the early spring, usually after they start to grow a bit. Now you can divide the cool season grasses in the fall, but if you're going to have a hard winter, that's probably not the best thing. You probably want to divide them early in the spring. Warm season grasses you divide after they start to grow is a good thing. So like March or April is a good time to divide them. We have some really fun ways of dividing grasses without an axe, and it's if you use a reciprocating saw. What I do is we dig around half the plant. Say you would want to divide a miscanthus, and it's big. You dig around half the plant, and you take the longest blade that you can on the reciprocating saw and just go zzz, right down the middle of it. Lift out this half. This half doesn't even know it's been divided, so it's a really slick way of doing it. And how you know that it's time to divide is when they start to donut or they die out in the middle and you just have this green ring around the edge, then you know that it's time to divide. Also a little bit about companion plants. You know, when I first started our display garden, I thought it'd be fun to just do 100% grasses. What I found is the grasses really do stand out more with some companion plants. So one of my very favorites is Rudbeckia, which is a yellow flower with a brown cone. And it's nice because it blooms late in the season. Actually, it'll bloom from August on through until frost. The nice thing is you don't cut the grasses back in the fall, and you don't cut the Rudbeckias back in the fall. So you have these wonderful grass plumes, and then you have these great seed heads, brown seed heads along with it. And they all provide food for the birds, which is a good thing. Other companion plants are sedum, which look great with it, like autumn joy, or the smaller sedums. The ground covers look good. Coneflowers. I have some Japanese iris blooming right now with the grasses. Oriental lilies are just spectacular with them. So a lot of different types of companion plants look good with the grasses, especially when they're blooming in the fall. So basically those are my top 10 or 11 questions, and I hope that answered some of yours.